So first, let's start by way of introductions. Who is this person who is suddenly talking to me? My name is Tulaine Montgomery, and I am co-CEO of a venture philanthropy called New Profit. And it is my esteemed, thank you, it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce you to John Friedman. This gentleman is the co-founder of Opportunity Insights, and we're going to talk a bit about what that means and the important work that he and his partner Chetty are doing. He is also the head of the economics department at Brown University. And so, you know, there's so many ways that I have had a somewhat troubled relationship with economics, the study of it, and so I'm so excited to be in this discussion with you. We are going to talk about making meaning. One of the things I think a lot about is that we as human beings, you know, we don't have a lot of like natural protections like other animals and species do. You know, we don't have fur, we don't have venom, we don't have fangs. But one of the things we have is the ability to make meaning. We are able to, in a way that no other species can, make meaning of the things that happen to us and make decisions in advance about what we do based on what we see and understand to be true. And we're living now in a season where every day we are inundated with information and insights that challenge us to make meaning, right? That challenge us to figure out what is the highest and best use of our time, our talent, our dollars, our ideas. And one of the gifts of the work that John and his team at Opportunity Insights are doing is that I believe, John, that you're helping us make meaning of what's happening right now in this country. You know, we've gone through something together that, you know, I don't know that we could have ever imagined. It's not over quite yet. I don't know, are we saying post-pandemic yet?
I think the government is about to declare us to be post-pandemic. I don't know whether that's already happened or that's going to happen,
okay.
But I think we should call it.
We should call it, okay. So you heard it here. We are now post-pandemic, right? And our minds are still swirling with all that's happened and the impact of it, and a lot has been made of learning loss, right? We've talked a lot about learning loss. And so part of what I want to do, John, is have you help us understand both what has happened and what we've learned based on what we've all been through collectively over the past few years together. So first, before we get into it, I want to get a little bit of a sense of who's in the room. I think that's important. And you know, you don't have to stand and declare, but maybe just put your hand up or nod your head, whatever you're comfortable with. Those of you who are involved in the business of education, meaning you teach in a classroom, you lead a school, you train teachers, you design curriculum, you provide educational resources to learning institutions. If that is your space and where you operate, just put your hand up so we can get a sense. Okay. Thank you. How many of you would say that you are involved in organizing? So not necessarily in the education space, but in sort of community organizing, mobilizing resources, family and communities. I saw a hand go up quickly. Raise your hand proudly. That's a good thing. All right. And any of you that are involved in as investors, funders, philanthropists? Okay. So we have a really good mix. One last question. Any of you who are actively engaged in storytelling, messaging, communications? Do any of you find that that's a big part of what you do day to day? I saw a hand do this. I saw a hand do this. Okay, we have a bit of that. I would offer that the stories we tell, the mental models, the way we understand and make meaning of what's happening to us, it shapes everything. At New Profit, we care a lot about systems change, and what we believe is that not only do we have to look at policy and data, we have to also look at mental models and beliefs. And again, I feel like, John, you're helping us look at beliefs. So let's get started. You and Chetty have been working to understand something that we call the American dream. I'm using air quotes. Why am I using air quotes? Because American dream is a term and a phrase that is fraught. It means different things to different people, but there is, I believe, agreement that over the past few years, and certainly accelerated by the pandemic, that the likelihood that one's work and effort could yield safety, security, and opportunity, that trajectory has been negatively impacted. So can you just talk a little bit about how you understand the American dream and what you're seeing happen to the idea of economic mobility in this country?
Well, thanks, Tulaine. And before I start, let me say thank you so much for that kind introduction. Sure. I agree with you. I think a lot of what we do at Opportunity Insights is try to make sense of all the data that's out there. My wife really laughs at me when I talk about trying to find the story to tell in the data, but I feel like that's exactly what we do. It's not just about throwing it up on the wall in some kind of collage. It's about really trying to learn about something in an organized way. And so, you asked about the American dream, and you're right, that's something that I think can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The sense in which we mean it is I think, quite intuitive proposition that a child's opportunities in life should not depend on the circumstances of their birth. And whether that's about race or socioeconomic differences or the neighborhood in which you happen to grow up, unfortunately, we see really sharp disparities across this country. And what we've tried to do is think about what are those aspects of a child's upbringing, whether they be part of the neighborhood or part of the school or part of some explicit government policy or the conditions that are created more broadly by government policy. What are those things that help determine a child's trajectory so that we can understand what are those sources of the disparities or what type of interventions, what can we do in order to close some of these gaps?
Okay, so what are the things, I'm repeating it back to make sure I'm understanding and tracking, you study what are the factors and experiences that shape a child's trajectory in terms of economic mobility, social mobility.
That's right.
And that's really powerful because there's sort of there's a thesis that's existed, certainly in the ed reform world and the social impact space in the US, that the main factor that can shift outcomes is education.
And I think you see that a lot in the data, right?
Yeah.
It's not just, I think what's so special about education, it's both something that is incredibly impactful on a child's trajectory, right? A child will spend, in many cases, the majority of their waking hours at a school during large parts of their life. But it's also something where we are very well geared towards making policy, right? So just to give you another example, the neighborhood in which you grow up also is incredibly important, but it is harder to make neighborhood policies, right? We do not think about how, we do not have, matching systems that, help organize who lives in what neighborhood. That's just not something we do as a society.
Right.
Whereas in many large school districts, that's an active area where, people debate about what's the right thing to do. And so I think education is probably the most impactful area of policy for shaping these upward mobility trajectories because of the confluence of those two things. It's important, and it's something where I think it's not easy to change, but we at least have the machinery to do so if we want.
To change it. So one thing I didn't say at the top of our time together is that we will have the opportunity to, John and I are going to chat a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So as you're listening to this conversation, if there's questions that are coming up for you, if there's reactions, comments, thoughts, jot them down. We will have a significant amount of time for us to be in dialogue together more broadly. Now, you're talking, John, about upward mobility. Now, upward mobility is different from inequality.
That's right.
So talk a little bit about how you distinguish.
So I think of inequality as really a combination of two different things, right? One thing is there can be kind of ex ante differences in opportunities, and then there can be ex post differences in kind of what happens.
Okay.
And I think that there are good reasons that one might want to think carefully about them both. It turns out that the thing that I said, that a child's opportunity should not be varying by the circumstances of their birth, that's something where, I don't want to say no one disagrees with that, but that is pretty widely held.
Okay.
And we found that that's kind of a tenet that can be used to connect with people in many, many different settings. Trying to think about inequality ex post, that comes with a bunch of different policies. And again, some of them are good and some of them are bad, but that turns out to be much, much more controversial. And also, I think in practice, those types of policies seem to be less impactful on people's lives as well.
Interesting.
And again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Right.
But you can really change someone's trajectory when you're thinking about children and their outcomes in a way that turns out to be much, much harder in the data once we're thinking about adults and where people are at 30
Yeah.
or 40.
Yeah. So this is interesting. And the wheels are spinning for me because there's a lot of conversation in the world of neuroscience. And if there's a neuroscientist in the room, forgive me. I know just enough to get myself in trouble. But there is very compelling research that says, the sort of, we wire and fire more powerfully in our brains in terms of creativity, innovation, adaptation, when we frame our work starting from a place of asset and possibility as opposed to problem identification as our origin point. And so it's interesting because you're saying upward mobility as a potential focus and shared goal. That's, one could argue, an asset orientation versus inequality, which is about defining oneself primarily, if not exclusively, by deficits, struggle, and challenge. What would you say?
No, I think that's right, because and you see this in the policy debate too, where policies designed to combat inequality per se tend to involve redistribution of one form or another. We're going to take away from Group A and we're going to give it to Group B.
Right.
And again, that's not saying that we don't want to do that.
Right.
I think it's much easier to see possibilities when you're thinking about upward mobility for ways that could really have very broad-based benefits to everybody. So let me give you an example. I think it won't surprise anyone in this room to know that one's chances of growing up to be an innovator, a scientist, somebody who has a patent, they're much higher if you are white, they're much higher if you are male, they're much higher if you come from a high-income family. And that turns out to be true even if you look only at the kids who get really, really great math scores in 3rd grade. And so, even for those group of people where you would have thought, kind of whatever's happened up till grade, they're 8, fine, these people are quite talented in math and maybe in science. Even among those people, you see these disparities. And so you think about, how much more cool stuff could we come up with? How many of these more problems could we solve if we had more people who were innovators, because we weren't just leaning on those people who could make it through the system, but we were creating the possibility for really everyone in a broad-based way to be an innovator.
So I think you're speaking to what was going to be my next question, which is, what is the argument for expanding upward mobility, right? Because it's an interesting balance. Here you have an audience full of people who are, building and designing innovation, funding innovation, writing about innovation. And so, you talk about patents and creativity, and that gets all of our juices going. And then you say that there's a disproportionate overrepresentation amongst one slice of our society. Can you talk a little bit more about what drives that? Like, what have you found in your research drives that disparate outcome you just told us about?
Yeah, so it's I think it's a complicated problem to unpack, but if I had to pick one thing, it seems to be about exposure as a child to adults who are doing this activity, who are in the innovation space, who look like you. And so, just to give you an example, women, or girls, are much more likely to grow up to become patent holders and inventors if they grow up in a region, like a country or a county or a city, where there are many more adult female scientists and patent holders. And I think that it's just, if you see someone doing that, you realize that, I can do that too. But if all the people you see that are doing it don't look like me, well, that's not for me. And so, but this is something where I think in a lot of different areas, the importance of connections and exposure and social capital and role models seems to be really very important. It's not something that's only, special about becoming a scientist.
Right. So I want you all to really take that in and consider that. Like, what are the implications of what John just shared? That one of the most powerful, effective, and you could argue efficient ways to expand this trajectory of upward mobility is to expand the references and examples of people who are upwardly mobile, right? So how do we deal with the fact that because of all the systemic imbalances that we all are so aware of, the volume of individuals who might reflect the identity of young people who have been outside of these opportunities? Like, how do we deal with that? So, for example, if we want to grow the number of, let's say, Black female students who have a patent, you know, the number of Black women who hold patents, they exist. However, it is not, as you said earlier, at the same scale for white males. So how do we, you know, sort of crack the code in terms of expanding this exposure that you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard problem, and you know, just to think about my own field, there are about 1,200 new PhDs in economics that are granted each year.
1,200.
1,200.
Okay.
In the last year for which there were data, 13 of them went to economists who identified as American Black individuals.
Wow.
And so, you know, that really creates kind of a chicken and the egg problem where, you know, you want to raise the profile and you want to highlight that such great work is being done by this group of people to inspire the next generation, but, you know, there are 13 of them. And so, you know, what we've done is we've tried to work backwards and think about, well, why are there only 13? What's the part of the pipeline that is leaking, for lack of a better word? And then we can figure out, well, why is it leaking, right? Is it that opportunities aren't available? Is it that, you know, people are just really excited about something else? And, you know, so for instance, again, there's no reason this has to be kind of a universal solution, but what we found was that for exactly the reason that you started with, that I think many people don't really understand what economists do, right? They would not have thought that the type of thing we're talking about is something that quite naturally falls into the research of an economist. There are many students who go through college and don't think about a career in academic economic research as something that would allow them to solve the type of problems that they're excited about or lead to a fulfilling career. And so we're trying to both create more opportunities in the curriculum for people to understand that disparities are the types of problems economists think about. We're creating more opportunities for people to get experience with research as students so they get a sense of whether they like it or not. And we'll see whether, you know, how much that pays off. But yeah, I don't think there's any alternative but to kind of do everything we can to change this.
So this is really interesting because what you're saying, John, is that, you know, obviously the research and the data is essential because it enables us to make meaning and understand what's even happening to us and around us. But also I hear that part of your work is the telling of the story. So for those 13 doctoral candidates, or they got their PhD. They got their PhD, those 13 Black American folks who received their PhD in economics out of the 1,300?
Yeah, something like that,
Something like that, who, you know, also had that same criteria. You know, the stories of those 13 need to be told and normalized without extracting too much from those 13, and that sometimes can be the challenge
it's an incredible
of that transition,
challenge.
right?
Because it's not fair to put it on them to become, you know, role models for everybody.
Right. So, okay, and I want to remind you again, we have about 5 minutes where we're going to continue this conversation, then we're going to move into open discussion. So my request is that I see some folks taking notes, and so that's a good thing. As soon as we say time for Q&A, my hope is that the hands shoot up, because this is really like the heart of what a lot of us are working on. You know, there's a set of unacceptable norms that we're trying our best to change, and we're leveraging technology, relationships, curriculum, teacher training. We're leveraging everything we can think of. And it's not clear that we totally understand even what we're solving for. So this, I think, is a very important conversation. Let's come back to this upward mobility. How do we stay the course on that and not have that sort of just dissolve solely into the pursuit of more wealth alone? Because I think some folks hear upward mobility as a goal, John, and it can be confused with, you know, it's about having as many people as possible get the bag, as the young folks would say. But you're talking about something more than just access to more income. That's part of it, but I feel like when you say upward mobility, you mean something a bit more holistic than just access to, you know, sustainable wage. Can you talk a little bit more about what upward mobility means to you?
I really think it's about giving people agency to make the choices that they would like to make from a positive perspective as opposed to from a scarcity perspective. And I think in many situations, it is in practice going to align with economic security, because I think it's just very difficult to achieve that state without some level of economic security. But then, there are all sorts of choices people make. And if some people want to go in a profession where they earn more and some people want to go in a profession where they earn less,
right.
That's totally fine. That's not, that's not what we're trying to do. I think it's also important to think about, right, it's not just about upward mobility at an individual level. It's about a society where kind of broadly there is shared mobility. And then it turns out, what does that depend on? It depends on essentially, first removing these barriers for people who face them, but also driving broadly shared economic growth. But if you look back over the past 40 years, most of the growth in the United States has gone to people at the top of the income distribution. And that's not the way it was for, call it, the 30 or 40 years before that. There's nothing kind of hardwired about this.
Right.
And what that's resulted in is an enormous growth in income inequality, but also it makes it much more difficult for mobility, right? You think about, it's kind of like a ladder, and as income inequality grows, it's like the rungs on the ladder are getting further apart. It just makes it not just harder to climb, but it also makes it much more impactful where on that ladder you are.
Right, that's right. And really changes the kind of ethos of this nation. I mean, back to where we started, as fraught as the idea of the American dream is, and as much as it is something that for some people has never really felt viable, this idea that we could build a nation with a participatory democracy where one could have the opportunity to determine one's path, that the broader the income gap, the less feasible and real that feels, and that impacts the democracy itself as well as the sort of economic viability of the country.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's such an important thing to study, because this is not just an economic problem. It's a social problem. I think, it turns out that upward mobility varies quite a bit based on just where you are in the country, even, for an individual of a given race. So for instance, it's absolutely the case that, poor white children growing up in Appalachia have a much harder path to economic security than people growing up here in San Diego or in many other places of the country. And I think that drives a lot of the political division that we see.
Absolutely. So one more question for you. Talk a little bit, John, about how things have changed over the past 3 years based on the research and the work that you all have done. We've seen an unprecedented shakeup of our education system. It would have been maybe even unimaginable for many of us just a few years ago. Talk to us about what has changed so we can keep making meaning of where we are right now.
So I think a lot of the work that people have done has been more retrospective. And what the pandemic, first of all, from a data perspective did, is it really moved people into more of a real-time analytic space, where the explosion of data has allowed us to not just learn 18 months later, how things were, but really assess things as we go. What those data showed during the pandemic was that, especially in that first few months, right, the remainder of the spring 2020 school year, I think many people in the room are going to be familiar with this. There were an enormous number of disparities that were really blown out by the experience of the pandemic. You saw kind of educational engagement falling everywhere, but it fell much, much faster for children from low-income communities, for children from Hispanic and Black communities than they did for others. And then it recovered much less quickly, right? If we kind of put ourselves back, middle of March 2020, kind of everybody goes home and like nobody knows what's going on. You fast forward to the middle of April, some schools had kind of gotten it back together, and others had just totally given up. And it really is a story of creating these very large disparities on top of what was already not a great situation. If you look at what happened over the past 3 years, we're still not back to where we are, but what I like about that is that there's been an enormous amount of energy and money and policy creativity directed towards this problem. Sometimes it takes a crisis like this to really get people to want to change something in a major way, right? If you look at the disparities that were created in the last, say the first year of the pandemic, they were large. They were actually not that large compared to the pre-existing disparities, right? It might have been another kind of 10 or 20%.
Yeah.
And I think what this shows us is that there actually is capacity to do something about this if there's this continued will. And so I think that's what I want to take most from the pandemic. Not, again, to come back to your, let's frame it from the perspective of an asset.
Yeah.
Not that things got really bad, but rather that we learned something about, how we can really go after this problem of disparities in education that are going to be so important towards closing these gaps in upward mobility. And if we can sustain that going forward, I think, maybe that's the best shot that we have for closing these gaps, maybe in a much more serious way over the next few years.
So I promise Q&A is happening. There's one more thing that I have to have you talk about. I feel like in general, John, you are pushing us with the research and work that you and Raj are doing to focus on assets, to focus forward, and to move together. And one thing that you talk about, a lot is made about learning loss, but you talk about the power of schools and institutions that instead of focusing on remediation, focus on acceleration of learning. Can you just spend a few beats talking about what you've observed the impact is of accelerated learning efforts versus learning loss recovery efforts?
Yeah, so I think that's a really nice example, both of something that turns out to be kind of a nice practical thing that can work, but also something that's really valuable at a deeper level as an example of something that we kind of learned from data in real time, right? It didn't have to be this way, but it turns out it is, and we're better off for knowing it. So just to kind of state what it is, so this is something that we looked at in partnership with Zern, where we were looking at kind of math data as it was coming in.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. There's kind of two ways. Think about, let's say, fourth graders who are out of school for all spring 2020. They're coming back to school in fall 2020. And there's a question, right? They've kind of lost a bunch of ground because they haven't been in school for 2 months, or they've been doing some remote stuff. And you could either just say, look, they didn't really get fourth grade, even though they're fifth graders, we're going to start them again in fourth grade, and we're just not going to let them go on until they really show that they've learned fourth grade. Or you can say, let's keep going. There are going to be some times where you're missing some things, and we'll just give you what you need to patch those holes as we go.
Right.
And again, I don't think there's anything that needs to be the fact this is true always, but it turns out in this particular case, students were much more successful when put on that second path, when they just kept going and they, kind of provided support where they needed, as opposed to remediated. And I'm guessing it's a combination both of continuing to create high expectations for students rather than labeling them as somebody who you had to go repeat what was going on. I'm guessing that there's a bunch of repetition already built into the fifth grade curriculum in a way that you don't have to necessarily kind of go back and totally master fourth grade in order to learn something in fifth grade. But again, more importantly, this was something that was generated basically from looking at the data as we went along. And I think that's something that we can do now that we couldn't do before.
Right.
And I think it would be great to have more of this kind of dynamic learning of how to teach well, because there be all sorts of different situations that we face. And the data are now good enough and real time enough that we can use that to our advantage.
It's really powerful. I mean, as a former classroom teacher, I would imagine that the accelerated learning approach also allows for more targeted, customized academic interventions, right? Like that you can be very specific and precise about what students need versus presuming through a remediation model what they need. Thank you so much, John. So now we're going to, as promised, move into some Q&A, and my hope is that we can really kind of seize this opportunity to dig into what is, the first sort of data set of its kind, which is really understanding in terms of education, employment, and upward mobility, what has happened to our children over the course of the past several years of this pandemic. So let's hear it. Do you have questions? Like, hands are shooting up. That makes me so happy. Forgive me for pointing. My mother would tell me it's rude, but please, sir, I'm pointing to you. Yes.
My name is Chetty. I really enjoyed this. What a tremendous conversation. I'm curious, in looking at the data, are there interventions that stand out to you? I know there are no silver bullets, but are there some interventions where if you were to prioritize, we should really be paying attention. We should really be paying attention.
So that's a great question. I'm not quite going to answer it because I think that, but here's why. So, in any given situation, right, there's people who are going to say, look, here are, 7 different things we can do, and we're going to calculate exactly, how many test score points are going to be gained per dollar for each one, or what's the increase in graduation rate, or something like that. And, some of them would come out on top, and some of them wouldn't. What I take away from the literature on this is not so much that one particular thing is more impactful than the other, but rather that we have so many different things that we seem to have figured out that do work.
Right.
There are smaller classrooms. There is great data about kind of increased in kind of tutoring, kind of individualized support. Really good data about the impact that high quality teachers can have. Good data about the impact of innovation and more using IT to have more personalized kind of instruction. And then there are many, many more. And so it's less that it's less that I have a strong feeling that one of those is absolutely the way to go, but rather I think there's so many things we know how to do. The issue is not which of them to choose. The issue is just making sure to mount a campaign to doing something at all. And I think that I would much rather see a set of policies where, for whatever reason in different places, you're going to try smaller classrooms, and Tulaine is going to try, a lot of emphasis on tutoring, and somebody else is going to, really invest in IT, rather than get ourselves locked into saying, look, if you're not doing the thing that I want to do, then it's just not worth doing at all. Because then I think we spend a lot of time fighting over, should we have smaller classrooms? Should we have more tutoring? Again, I'm not saying that there isn't, that one might not be better in certain circumstances than the other, but I would rather not spend that energy fighting over that margin and just let's do some stuff. There's a lot of ground that we have to cover, and seems like there's a lot of things that could be productively involved in the solution.
Thank you. Other questions? Other questions? Yes, sir. Go ahead, please.
So our Chicago Scholars, our theory of change is about creating windows and mirrors. Mirrors, the research you talk about, we're going to see women who have patents, there's more likely to be patent holders, but also windows of bridging and creating relationships across socioeconomic differences, and the powerful way of creating mobility.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of research on that side of the window side, the relationships across different?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example where it turns out, as I said, there's an enormous amount of variation across the US in terms of upward mobility. And that's not just kind of from city to city, there is a bunch of city to city difference, but even within a city, there are neighborhoods that are very high upward mobility, there are neighborhoods that are very low upward mobility. That holds even if you, again, take race and other kind of big level stuff out of it. It turns out that the single most powerful predictor at that neighborhood level of upward mobility has to do with the level of social capital, in particular measured through socioeconomic social integration. And I think what's going on there, I think it's exactly what you are thinking about in terms of windows into differences. So imagine a student who is coming into high school, and let's say they are coming from a family where no one's gone to college before. If they are spending all their time with other students who also come from families where no one's gone to college before, right, it's much more likely that they just don't think of going to college as something that's for them.
Right.
I'm not saying that we can't change that, but I think you're kind of starting from, from a place of deficit. If that student has lots of friends with people who come from backgrounds where their parents went to college, their older siblings went to college, just like everybody went to college, right? Those students are going to have a very different outlook where they say, well, of course I'm going to college. Like I never even considered that I wouldn't go to college.
Right.
And then the first student that we talked about is going to start to start to adopt that mentality. Because just there are other people around and it becomes normalized, and they realize that it's not all about seeing people who are like you, but just seeing people around you who realize that this is something that they might think about. They're going to start to think about that as well. And so that seems to be, again, something, there are many examples that are going to go beyond that, but those types of connections seem incredibly important in understanding these pathways. Now, trying to, we talk about, some of the things we have policy for,
Right.
trying to change, who you're friends with, that's hard.
That's hard.
But at least I think we have some sense of what are the dynamics
Right.
that drive children on these different trajectories, and then we can think about whether it's policies in schools or out-of-school activities that bring children together from different backgrounds, or a lot of very exciting art programs, for instance. Get
Right.
people playing in a symphony together, or
Right.
playing on sports teams turn out to be a very, actually it turns out the two types of organizations that are best at getting people to mix across kind of racial and socioeconomic lines are sports teams and churches, or religious institutions more
Really?
generally, yeah.
The religious institution surprises me a bit, but that's
Yeah, but again, exactly. But just so I be careful here, so the data from this particular study are unable to measure race, and so
Okay.
I don't know, and
Yeah.
religion can be segregated in many places, but in terms of mixing across socioeconomic backgrounds,
Yes.
it turns out that religious institutions are pretty good at that.
Yeah. So here's one thing I'm going to lift that I sometimes struggle with, and I want you to help me, and I want the group to help me and all of us with this. When we talk about the windows, the fact that it is proven, there's evidence to show that the social capital across race and socioeconomic condition, that is one of the best ways to propel people into upward mobility. I've seen some people take that fact and weaponize it to turn a blind eye towards the assets and genius that exist in communities of color and low-income communities, the resilience, the grit, the creativity, all of the things that are abundant, right? So how do we understand that kind of socioeconomic connection is important without translating it into a devaluing of the assets and innovations that exist in low-income communities?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the type of thing that just observing that there are different places with different levels of connectivity, that's a great example of why that does not lead immediately to some policy prescription.
Right.
And I think the reason is that, my guess is that those places which are more integrated, where children have friendships that go across all these barriers, those are situations where those things have arisen organically in a way that simultaneously gives people a diversity of perspective, but in a way that respects the different backgrounds that everyone comes from.
Right.
Where I think too often, if you try to say, great, who a kid's friends are matters, and so now we're going to design who sits with whom, and we're going to try to socially engineer this. Right. That then starts to, I'm not saying that there wouldn't be some way to make this work, but that then starts to create, try to create ties in a way that's very inorganic, in which may not lead to those same beneficial effects. And so I think you got to be very careful about, how kind of what you want to take from these studies. Yeah.
So I'm getting the signal. And so what I want to do is make sure people hear how they can learn more about your research. And I want to say what I'm hearing you tell me is that, part of why you want us to take time learning, tracking the data, understanding it, is because we can't leap to policy. We can't skip the step of building actual relationships, right? That in true relationships, we can see the assets we all bring. But if we sort of try to socially engineer it from on high, that we're going to miss some steps and maybe even cause harm. And so I want to make sure that people can hear where they can get information about your research, and then we're going to close. So please, how do people find out more about your work?
So the organization is called Opportunity Insights, and the website is opportunityinsights.org. And we have lots of different, not just research projects, but we try hard to provide opportunities for people to look at the data themselves. So for instance, we were talking about differences across places and people and upward mobility. there's an online tool called the Opportunity Atlas, where you can look at your own community. You can look at how it varies within a couple miles of where you grew up often.
That's great.
And what I will say is that if you look at the map and you see something that you think is interesting and noteworthy about a community that you know about, please reach out and let me know. I learned so much interesting stuff from people who look at these data. Because someone from San Diego is going to know so much more about why certain neighborhoods are the way they are, than I do.
Yes.
I grew up in Boston. I can do it for Boston, but I learned an enormous amount from talking with other people about this. So thank you so much for taking the time to share in this conversation this afternoon.
Thank you,
and
John. Thank you.
I hope to hear from many of you.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you guys. Thank you.